Hello, everyone. So today I would like to quickly mention about the last part of chapter one. And this part, we call it the nature of science. In the upcoming uniform test, we seldom ask the concept of nature of science. So if you do not have enough time to revise biology, you can simply skip it and watch it after the uniform test, as it is quite important um, for you if you would like to be a biologist or if you like to be a scientist, because it is the concept or it is some idea for us to be a scientist. So therefore, it is quite important, but just we do put the least priority in the upcoming uniform test. So nature of science, in fact, it referring to um, some important idea when we learn biology or when we study biology. So we do have a short term for us to mention about the nature of science. We call it the NOS. So whenever when we talk about or when we mention about NOS, um, it, it is the nature of science. Okay, we're referring to the nature of science. So maybe let me use an example to go through what is the idea or what is the nature of science. So let me use this as an example. So for 1,000 years, people believe that the living things can arouse from some non-living things by a what we call the spontaneous process. Okay, the spontaneous process or generation. So under the spontaneous generation, so you can think it like in this way. So um, for example, maybe um, the dog or the cat, it will or the bird, it will come out from the soil or from the dust or maybe from coming out from the metals. So this will be the idea of spontaneous generation. However, a scientist, okay, really, they observed that in fact the maggots appear after a few days after the flies move around a piece of meat. So he tried to make a hypothesis. He think that, okay, oh, the maggot were produced by the flies, and it is not coming out from some non-living things. So therefore, we can see that in fact science, okay, the concept advanced through some reasonable uh, maybe doubt or what we call the skepticism. So this with the reasonable skepticism, then we can um, have some uh, very brave idea coming out. So then, in this case, based on his hypothesis, so the scientists try to predict that if the flies were kept away from the meat, then in this case, the maggot would not appear. So he then designed um, an experiment to test his hypothesis. So in this case, he have one experimental setup, which is leave the meat inside the bottle or inside the a jar of a gas a glass jar, and then without cover it. So another control setup, the jar was covered by maybe a layers of maybe the tiles or gaze, etc. Then in this case, we can see that doing science, it requires creativities. And apart from that, it also needs some imagination. So it is quite difficult if we, based on some previous experiment, to develop without any creativity or without any imagination, ch- we could not create some new experiment. So therefore, doing science, we require some creativities and also imagination. And apart from that, if we only work on the experimental setup, then many other scientists may be questioned about your design. And therefore, it is important for us to design a controlled setup so that to show that only the independent variable would cause the results in this experiment. So therefore, a good scientific experiment must include carefully designed control setup. So after a few days, really, in fact, it observed that in fact the maggots appear only in the experimental setup, but not in the control setup. So these results support his hypothesis. In this case, he believed that um, the the spontaneous generation, in fact, is not true. Um, because you can see that even though there is um, it meets here, they cannot suddenly create some maggots. In fact, it required the touch, or it required the flies land on the meat. So in this case, he tried to um, persuade other scientists to um, believes his hypothesis or his result. However, at that time, as there is no any discovery of the microorganisms, then in this case, not many people believe his belief or his idea. So in this case, after uh, 17th, then there is a scientist perform an experiment. He then realized that, in fact, there is some microorganisms, and these microorganisms is in fact is come from nowhere, and this strengthen the beliefs of what really mentioned. In fact, the lives is not coming from the spontaneous generation, meaning that it is not coming from some non-living things. So therefore, um, Needham, he tried to do an experiment. He boiled a flask of some, you can think some nutrition, some nutrition, nutritional solution, and these contain some microorganisms. And once he boiled it, he think that, in fact, we already killed the microorganisms in the flask and stopped the flask. However, a few days later, the broth, turns into cloudy solution containing microorganisms. So in this case, this scientist concluded that, in fact, the living things did arise from some non-living things. So we call it the spontaneously. So we can see that originally the idea is maybe the beliefs from the people would be, the living things or the organisms is coming out from the spontaneous generation. However, with some scientists performing some creative experiment, then in this case, it no longer come or it no longer um, believe, or some scientists or some people do not believe in this idea. However, with other scientists, it shows an other experiment to fight against the previous belief, then in this case, we can see that in fact science is a process of ongoing inquiries. So it do change a lot. It require a lot of time to develop. Then later on, another scientist did not agree with the previous scientist. He suspect that, in fact, Needham did not boil the broth or the nutrient solution long enough to kill all the microorganisms. So therefore, in 70s, he carried out a similar experiment and obtained different results. So he tried to boil it for a long time. Then, without sealing the flask, in fact, the microorganisms appear. But then, the control setup, he also make another setup. So this time, he boil it for a very long time, and in this case, he sealed the flask, and after a few days, there is no any microorganism. So we can see that scientists have to explore using different techniques and methods to find out a good solution to a problem. So therefore, these results show that in fact the microorganism did not appear in the boiled broth when the flask is sealed. However, many people were not convinced, so they argued that air was required for the spontaneous generation to happen. But this idea was not falsified until almost a century later by another scientist. But with more and more scientists, they carry out different experiments. And also with the technology, because we noticed that in Form 1, you have learned that um, there is a scientist invents a special equipment so that we can see, oh, how this very tiny living things survive in this environment. Then in this case, we believe that in fact the living thing is not coming from the spontaneous generation. For example, later on, some people they developed the microscope. And in this case, with the advancement of the microscope, now the scientific knowledge has been changed. So we can see that um, the technology will limit the scientific knowledge. And this is also a type of nature of science. So these would be some types of nature of science that we need to know and you need to mention once, okay, when the teachers or when the questions ask you about the nature of science. So this would be the part for the nature of science. So I hope you can these can deepen your understanding. Okay, so today we will stop here related to the nature of science. So all the best with your uniform test. Thank you very much.